Yeah, well, we did have a meeting with them a couple of years ago, and I was there with at the BPS about this, and we also brought up a contradiction with international people, that, you know, that they don't recognise people like Falco's qualifications, for example. No, because they won't recognise, you know, they don't, there's no recognition of international qualifications, things like that. So they would, you know, it's but to be fair, it needs to be talked about. There was something where there was some exam where you scrap that part. Because I know when I spoke to Frank about it, he said you get to the cost of this, so you can do this and something other, and yet allow him to become a, you know, and it's just ridiculous. So there are too many contradictions, but it's just really difficult to get anything changed. And that's what makes you work about this whole restructuring principle that, you know, you can end up having it even more centralised. But obviously, yeah, you all said that here, I don't want to.
You'll antagonise all the wrong people.
I know.
Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to a kind of first for the Division of Health Psychology. This is the first time we've ever had a live webinar, and I think this reflects a number of things. It reflects how the discipline, I think, has moved forward, but also reflects a breakthrough in terms of what we have today in terms of Vincent Deary. Vincent is, as many of you will be aware, is a health psychologist who's based at Northumbria University, and he is unique in the sense that he does both research and clinical practice. And what we hope today is that Vincent's going to talk to us about a number of things, particularly a case study and his thinking about how we break, how we mend. But what's important to note is that one of the reasons why Vincent is here today is because he last year published what I think is a very, very important book, which is a popular science / practitioner book called How to Live. It's part of a series. He's not going to talk very much about this book today, but certainly when I've read this book, it's been hugely influential to my thinking and also to many other people's thinking. But all I want to say, I'm going to pass over to Vincent. What we plan to do is Vincent's going to speak to us for about 35 minutes. He's going to talk about his research and some of his practice, and then we're going to open it up to questions. There's a number of people who have emailed and the Division of Health Psychology with questions for Vincent, but also we'd like to welcome questions from the audience. So please, whilst Vincent's chatting to us, think about any questions you'd like to offer to him. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Dr. Vincent Deary, who's going to talk to us about his work in science and practice. Vincent.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Darryl, for that lovely introduction, and thank you for making me your webinar guinea pig, which hopefully it will go fairly smoothly. Let me just move these. So today I wanted to talk. Hey, it worked. Great. So the first technical hitch has been passed. Today I wanted to talk about a case, and we're going to call this case Anne, and I hope it goes without saying as a pseudonym. And Anne is based on several clients that I've seen in a clinic that I will talk about in due course. And let's begin. Let's begin by talking about Anne. Anne is you or me. Anne she's a conscientious, bright individual working in a large institution. I could have picked academia as the institution or the NHS. If it helps you identify with her more, think about your life in academia. But she's an individual working within a large institution. That's the setting where Anne's drama happens. She's a single mum, and as she does her work conscientiously, she's also a very conscientious single mum. She devotes a lot of her energy and time to it. She gets some help from her sister, but in fact that relationship is more one where she's the helper. Her sister, in fact, probably takes more help if we can add these things up than she gives. So like many people that I work with clinically and also colleagues, Anne is one of those people who is always helping other people and putting herself last. And she's what we might call a stoic coper. She just gets on with stuff. And if stuff is difficult, she just goes up a gear until the difficulty is dealt with. And in the clinic where we met Anne, and we're reviewing what went wrong because, as I'm sure you've guessed, something is going to go wrong in this story. Anne said that looking back from the age of 17, she said, all I remember is just a trajectory of achieving and getting on with it and going on to achieve the next goal. Anybody recognising themselves in this kind of picture of achievement and striving? And she said, looking back, and this is something... No, she wasn't saying this next sentence, looking back, I can't recall a time when I was happy. She wasn't saying that from a depressed position. She was saying it more in a kind of air of genuine surprise. It had just always been about achievement and coping. And it was only when things began to go wrong, which paradoxically gave her some space for reflection, that she began to see that things were different than the story in her head about it. So she presented with fatigue and symptoms of autonomic dysregulation, which we won't unpick too much. Let's just say that lots of flushing, sudden drops in blood pressure, fainting, fatigue, and a whole bunch of symptoms which, if any of you are familiar with Rona's work, we might call medically unexplained symptoms, but more accurately, probably in her case, persistent physical symptoms, but certainly disabling physical symptoms that were stopping her working. So when I saw her, she'd been off work with these symptoms, extremely exhausted, like unable to get out of bed, exhausted, sleeping loads of hours a day, fainting when she got up, and just her body was all over the place. It was really quite extreme. So where did we see Anne? You probably can't see most of the print on that slide. I work in a transdiagnostic fatigue clinic. So we see fatigue, whether your fatigue is caused by cancer chemotherapy, liver disease, Sjogren's syndrome, or the kind of pre-diagnostic, non-diagnosed kind of symptoms that Anne had, we will see you. And we won an award because we're one of the first transdiagnostic fatigue clinics, very much based on this notion of a pain clinic, where you've got a one-stop shop for your pain problems, whatever causes them. So we're trying to set up a similar model around fatigue. So you can see a consultant who's much more tuned into the bio side of things. You can see me health psychologist, obviously more psychosocial, plus there's a physio and an OT, and a sleep specialist. So you get a kind of all-round assessment and treatment package when you come to see us. So that's where we saw Anne. So we're working from the viewpoint of looking at symptoms rather than trying to make a particular diagnosis. So how can we help Anne? And part of the reason I've put we in the title and throughout the slides is because, and this notion has come up a few times today, I genuinely think that a lot of the symptoms we're working with only make sense, or make a lot more sense, if we work with them transdiagnostically. For instance, these are just some of the conditions I'm involved in researching at the moment: IBS, fibromyalgia, Sjogren's, fear of falling in older adults, people who've got chronic unexplained cough. In all of them, fatigue has emerged as a major issue. And I think, and probably preaching to and head and neck cancer as well, we're doing some lovely work, which if I've got time I'll talk about as well, with head and neck cancer survivors around food. But the thing that keeps coming up alongside food is fatigue. They're all knackered, particularly the ones who are fairly close to being post-treatment. So I probably don't need to tell the people in this room that fatigue is biopsychosocial. But I want to unpick a bit about what that actually means, particularly in Anne's case, over the next 30 minutes. So let's start slightly left field and talk to engineers and pilots about how we might understand how systems break, how fatigue happens in systems. So how did Anne become a case? I don't know if you recall, it was probably about 6 months ago. There was a couple of reports that both came out on the same day. One was about child abuse, one was about failings in a hospital. They were both government-funded reports. And they both used exactly the same phrase. They both said, what happened in these cases was not one factor going wrong, it was a toxic mix. It was a toxic mix of things, several things going wrong at once. And if you look at the way engineers, both hardware and software engineers, test and talk about the functioning of systems, they have a way of talking about that. And they talk about it in terms of corner cases and edge cases. Anybody familiar with those terms? Good. So I can say what I like, even if it's inaccurate. And it's fairly straightforward. So if you think of, it doesn't work here. If you think of the safe functioning of any system as being in its middle. So if you're in the middle of that space, your system's working fairly well. If one of the parameters of your life, if we're thinking about the human system, begins to kind of go up, turn up to 11, as they would say in spinal tap, if one of the parameters begins to go to the edge, you've got an edge case. So we could think, say, of trauma, where one thing goes catastrophically wrong. But what we more often see in the clinic is not one catastrophic or traumatic thing, it's several things going wrong at once. So if you think in terms of this as a three-dimensional space, we're talking about things beginning to veer towards a corner. More than one thing is going wrong at once. So it's that toxic mix of several factors going wrong at once that often leads to coming to see me in a clinic. And indeed, that was the case in Anne's case. So the sister who she'd been both supporting and getting support from died. She got a new manager at work who was very much the opposite of the hands-off style that she appreciated, was micromanaging, setting new targets. And a couple of key colleagues who she got a lot of support from also went off sick, partly because of the new culture at work. So a lot of things began to go wrong at once for Anne, a real toxic mix. A nice definition of a corner case is from the West Wing, where they're worried about a nuclear meltdown. And the advisor to the president puts it this way: a meltdown isn't when one thing goes wrong, it's when 12 things go wrong. And indeed, that's exactly what was happening to Anne. When I did a version of this talk to the School of Life, where there was a public lay audience, one of them was a pilot who'd been involved in human factors training for pilots, looking at what are the factors that predict crashes. And one of the things that they talk about there is the bucket of capacity. Again, that was a fairly new phrase to me. And that when people's bucket of capacity fills up, they can no longer function. They can no longer do the cognitions and behaviours they need to. And again, that's not when one thing goes wrong, it's when 12 things go wrong. And if you combine that, and I'm very wary of these idiosyncratic narratives that blame the patient, but if we combine that with that heroic, stoic coping style, where she's just trying to cope with the more there is to cope with, eventually something has to break. And indeed it did. And if it had just been a blip, if Anne could get back to normal, as it were, that would have been fine. But this constant adjustment that was being asked of her eventually seemed to wear her system out. Or certainly, that would be our story about it. That would be the psychobiological, the neurocognitive, or the psychoneuroimmunological story. And I'm indebted to my colleague, very, very expert psychoneuroimmunologist Mark Wetherill, who has given me this slide. So he could talk about it much more eloquently than I could. But are most of us familiar with the idea of allostasis? For those that aren't, it's homeostasis, you're working hard to stay the same. Allostasis, you're working hard to adjust to a new normal. So what Anne is having to do is adjust to a whole new bunch of set points. The old way won't work anymore, so homeostasis won't work. So she has to do the work of adjustment. And what we know from some of the research that Mark and others have been involved in is allostasis can sometimes go wrong. If we're being asked to adjust too much all the time, or if the stuff that we're being asked to adjust to goes on for too long, it looks like that may have a knock-on effect on the way that we function at a physiological level. And I think that's part of the work that we're doing when we're working with these so-called medically unexplained symptoms. We're beginning to see that they actually make quite a lot of sense at one level. Again, I'm not going to go into this too much. It's more just to highlight that there are narratives around, say, for instance, why Anne was getting autonomically dysregulated, i.e. why her the nervous system that dealt with the everyday functioning of her body was acting very strangely, and why she was fatigued. And we can see that in various fields, in chronic fatigue syndrome, in fibromyalgia, we're beginning to see that allostatic loads, the effect that might have on the autonomic nervous system, the immune system, that these things are complex, but it doesn't mean we can't or shouldn't talk about them. Neither does it necessarily mean that that's Anne's story, or indeed the way she talks or understands her symptoms at this particular moment. Indeed, when we saw Anne, she didn't understand her symptoms at all. The reason I'm talking about her as opposed to anybody else is because we caught Anne at a rare moment. I was asking earlier about what's the average length of diagnosis from onset to diagnosis in chronic fatigue syndrome, one of the many diagnoses Anne may have ended up with. And patients often report at least a couple of years. And some of the work that we're currently doing up in the northeast is we're looking at patient pathways with people with fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, IBS, and what we're seeing is more than any other condition I can think of, it's very much based on luck. So if you happen to meet the right professional at the right time who knows the local expert in fibromyalgia, who's got access to the pain service, you're in. But you could equally wander in the wilderness, as many of the patients we interviewed did, for several years before you even get a diagnosis. Whereas if you've got cancer or if you've got diabetes, although the service may not be great, there's a clear pathway. So the role of luck in the way that the narratives and the experience of these symptoms end up being experienced, I think has been underestimated. We were lucky, or Anne was lucky to an extent, to actually end up with a bunch of experts in fatigue even before she got a diagnosis, just through luck of who she happened to meet in the referral system. So in a way, Anne's quite a unique case, but it certainly argues for some of the stuff that Rona and Catherine, who are both in the room, I think, are doing on early intervention. It makes a lot of difference, or it did in Anne's case. So where is Anne in the story? She hasn't got a story yet. So what we're going to look at over the next few slides is the process of story making. How do we make sense of the stuff that's happening to us when we're in the thick of it? So how do we make sense of change? And this is where I think it's useful for us to have a dialogue with other disciplines, because I think other disciplines have thought a lot about change in a way that we can learn, and certainly in a way that helped Anne. So anybody familiar with Arthur Frank's work on the wounded storyteller? He talks about different illness narratives, and this has been work that we're currently doing work with GPs up in Aberdeen, and also with GPs in Newcastle, with Chris Burton, who's an academic GP up in Aberdeen, where we're looking at the way doctors talk about and explain so-called medically unexplained symptoms. And the stuff that we keep coming back to, and the stuff that's becoming part of our intervention, is storytelling. So we're actually talking to GPs about the way they tell symptom stories. And some of the stories from the viewpoint of the person who's in the illness, their illness narratives, is there's three basic kinds according to sociologist of illness, Arthur Frank. So there's the restitution narrative. This is the narrative of having a cold. I was okay yesterday, I'm ill today, I'm going to be okay tomorrow. So it's a kind of there and back again journey. You get back to a new normal, so it's a homeostatic journey. Then there's the stuff that is more in the field of long-term conditions and potentially medically unexplained symptoms, which is the journey of having to adjust to a new normal, of getting used to it. So the stuff that we're doing with head and neck cancer survivors, the stuff that we're doing around fear of falling in older adults, a lot of people talk about adjusting to a new set of limitations and eventually getting to a place where they're living the life they want to lead within these new limitations. So we could see that as a quest narrative, because people talking about learning about themselves. We were in a workshop earlier where we were talking about the spiritual dimensions of managing pain, for instance, and people who can find some meaning in it. That's the typical quest narrative. The one that really screws you up, or the one that is really difficult to deal with, is the chaos narrative, where you can make no sense of your condition, and none of the people you're working with can help you make sense of it, which is unfortunately often the case with medical encounters. So it's almost like a failed allostasis. You're not able to reach the new normal. And to illustrate that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of the movies. So if you go and see a movie, you don't want to go and see someone kind of jump from Act 1, where life is kind of okay, to Act 3, where they've reached some kind of new equilibrium. What will take up most of the bulk of the movie is Act 2. You go to a movie to watch someone suffering, and to watch someone suffering and adjust. And that is what Act 2 is about. Act 1 is the old normal, the status quo. And this red arrow, which usually happens within the first 10 minutes of a typical movie, is the inciting incident. It's the stuff that sets the drama going. So Anne had a whole bunch of those inciting incidents. So I wanted to use this to talk a bit about change. So as health psychologists, I think we're quite good at talking about the old normal. Anybody familiar with Ron Borland's elephant? This idea that a great deal of the underbelly of our life is automatic. Ron Borland, an Australian health psychologist, I think, or certainly he's in Australia now, compares it to an elephant. So there's this mass of stuff that keeps our daily life running, and consciousness and intention are just the rider who occasionally needs to give the elephant a little bit of a poke, but most of the work is done by habit. I think as health psychologists, we overemphasize how much habits are embedded in the individual and not just in the institutions and relationships in which they're embedded. So with Anne, it wasn't her own stuff that was changing, it was stuff around her, but stuff where she was used to routines working in a certain way. So habit's not just inside us, it's also embodied and embedded. And then in the drama, in Anne's life, as we move from Act 1 to Act 2, as it were, we go through transitions. And I think I'll save you all the trouble of reading my next book by... Most people break in transitions. That is where things tend to go wrong, when too many things are going wrong at once. Samuel Beckett put it much more eloquently than I could. He talked about transitions being those perilous zones in the life of the individual. Dangerous, precarious, painful, mysterious and fertile, when for a moment the boredom of living is replaced by the suffering of being. Trust Beckett to be so cheerful, but I think he does stick in a key word there, which is fertile. That although those times are difficult, and again as health psychologists we've got a sense of this, that it's often easier to change habits when all the other parameters are a bit up in the air, when things are a bit more up for negotiation. So although those times of change are difficult and we want to get back to some kind of normal as quickly as possible, they're potentially quite fertile. And just as a kind of almost neurocognitive psychology echo of Beckett, we see that certainly some of the philosophers of neuroscience saying that, that we're basically built to be resistant to change. Damasio calls us homeostasis machines. We're very, very good at staying the same. So we're innately built to find change difficult. What causes change? Well, in Anne's case, of course, it was new stuff happening. Nice quote from Daniel Dennett, who's looking at the positive side of change, how when two worlds collide is also when creativity happens. So also, some of the good encounters, if we think of encroachment as encounter, that Anne had, was meeting the right people on her illness journey to help her make sense of it. The other thing that, of course, can start a drama or can start an Act 2 is departures. So again, another West Wing quote, quotes, the most costly disruptions always happen when something we took for granted stops working for a moment. And anybody who's been through any kind of grief or loss knows that that's true, that those are the times when the rug is pulled from under our feet, as was certainly the case with Anne. So, this is where Anne's at. We caught Anne in crisis, and I don't know if any of you work clinically. It's fairly rare to catch someone in crisis. Some of the GPs we're working with at the moment, one of them has got a real insight into the patients he's got who are suffering from long-term conditions, both explained and unexplained, both emotional and physical. And he pointed out something that's, I guess, fairly obvious to us all, that, for instance, depression at 10 years is very different from depression at 3 months. That the duration of a condition, even though it hides under the same name, makes a big difference to its ontology and its place in your life. And similarly, if we had caught Anne maybe 10 years down the line, as some people often don't get to our clinic until then, as opposed to just a couple of months in, I think her story would have been very different. But we caught her in crisis, and we caught her while she was still trying to do that work of adjustment in the middle of Act 2. So she's preoccupied, her emotions all over the place, and physiologically she's a mess. So we've caught her in that kind of Act 2 adjustment, allostasis, too many words for the same thing, phase. So what do you do when you're in that? How do you actually make sense of the change whilst you're in it? Not just as structure, but in terms of content. And again, I think this is where we can have some useful dialogue with other disciplines. One of the people who we're doing the research in Aberdeen with is the sociologist Monica Greco, who's at Goldsmiths. And she talks, and her team are looking at liminality. Again, liminality was a fairly new concept to me, but just to give you a sense of what it means, well, literally it means being on the threshold. So again, it's just another way of talking about when you're no longer what you were, but you're not yet what you're going to be. So sociologists discovered the idea of liminality in looking at major life transitions. So from going from youth to adulthood, from going from singleness to marriage, and a lot of our society's rituals, and they still are built around those liminal threshold spaces where we're transitioning from one state to another. And as this author notes, and I'll just read the last bit of this, an experience of liminal space can also arise from unscheduled life events that thrust us into the wilderness, such as the unexpected death of a loved one or the breakdown of a marriage. Both kinds of transitions bring people to therapy. And again, echoing Samuel Beckett's note about these times also being fertile, Stenner and Clinch note that liminal and highly affective situations can in fact provide the conditions for personal and social transformation. And that was certainly the case in Anne. The mystics and the theologians talk about these kind of times as the dark night of the soul, the bit where there is no narrative. It's their equivalent of the chaos narrative, where there isn't a story of what you're going through. And the way some of them talk about it is when you're on that transitional path, the difficult stuff is going to come up. They talk about it as being your dweller on the threshold. But they all echo the same idea that when you're in those transitional liminal states, that's when a lot of difficult issues come up. And again, Anne was lucky enough to meet a team who could help her make some sense of that. And that's where this key insight for her began to come up. That she said, or in about session 3 or 4, she began to say, I actually can't recall a time when I was happy, when I was putting myself first. So, what actually helped Anne? Well, first of all, there was the stuff that we may or could describe under the aegis of CBT, in that she did if people heard of the cognitive triad, some people talk about the achievement and pleasure and closeness being the stuff that we need to have a sense of well-being. So we need some sense of achievement, we need some intimacy and closeness, and we need stuff that's pleasurable, comforting, nourishing. Anne was very good at the first. She was a high achiever. What she learned to do in the process of therapy was do more of 2 and 3. She learned to do a bit more closeness and a bit more pleasure. She actually began to turn to other people for help and actually began to nourish herself. So much or so far, so idiocentric a version. Idiocentric in the sense that we're actually saying to Anne implicitly, actually, if you change your thinking and your behaviour, you'll cure your situation. In fact, that wasn't the bulk of the work that Anne ended up doing. For her, it was much more not about re-evaluation of her own values. It was about an almost political reorientation. And there was two kind of inciting incidents of this change for her. When she got ill and went back to try and claim benefits or to have the system recognise her as ill, she was very badly treated. People who had been friends, people who had actually been on her side, turned on her. The HR system was very, very unkind to her, and they just constantly wanted to know when she was going back to work. And she said at that point she realised that she thought she'd been valued as an individual within the system, and in fact she realised at that point all she was for the system was a fuse that blew, and that they wanted to know either when that fuse was going to be back or when they could put a new fuse in her place. And when she saw two of her colleagues break in a similar way by being overloaded within that system, she began to question the amount of energy and love that she put into that system. So I think one of the things that as health psychologists we too easily forget is we need to look at the political and social context in which the stuff that we're working with happens. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Anne's work culture, and I found it very difficult to find a way to illustrate this. And so I've tried to do it with some pictures. I don't know if you can make out the words on that. I spent some time in Holy Island up north recently, and as you drive into it, you meet a sign that just says, "You are responsible." And it's then going to tell you on the next thing, but you never see it if you drive past it quickly. It's to do with the tides. You're responsible for keeping track of the tides. But there was this basic message of you're responsible, combined with this basic message that everything is very difficult. So if we think, I don't know, I've worked in institutions most of my adult life, and institutions have changed a great deal over the last 20 years. What used to be places of safety, or this would be the political analysis, since business models have been incorporated into them, have become much more places that are driven by stuff like the cycle of continuous improvement. I was talking to Margaret Husted about this earlier, and we were saying that people who go into academia often go in expecting a fairly stable, low competition culture. But now that we're all in this culture of competition, impact, output, and getting in as many people as we can, we're much more in a kind of business climate. And that is something that people don't necessarily go into the NHS or academia for. So Anne talked about this, and I'm trying to illustrate Anne's world rather than make a political statement. She said what she noticed was the colleague who was throwing up every morning before they went into work, the colleague who was in tears at their desk every day, being asked to do more and more with less and less, and being subject to this continual evaluation. And the institution's response was the second inciting incident that really drove Anne to make some major changes. This didn't happen to her, this happened to two of her colleagues. They were both they went to complain about how things were changing, and they were offered resilience training. So, may not sound like a bad idea, but as some political commentators have suggested, and I'm going to read this bit out to you because I think it's important, that resilience demands our disavowal of any belief in the possibility to secure ourselves, and we have to accept that life is a permanent process of continual adaptation to dangers said to be outside our control. The resilient subject is a subject which must permanently struggle to accommodate itself to the world. And these authors describe this ideology of resilience as politically catastrophic and fundamentally nihilistic. I'm not saying it's true, but I think we do need to think about when someone's in that kind of extremity, saying to them that they just need to go and man up, as it were, is not necessarily the kindest intervention, but that's essentially what they were told by the institution. Both those colleagues then left at that point. And similarly, there's been some interesting critiques around mindfulness. And Zizek is a controversial figure, and I don't necessarily buy either his version of Buddhism or the critique, but I think he makes the point to alert us. I think one of the functional contextualists, any acceptance and commitment therapy fans in the room? I think they asked us, they say that we should ask a very important question of any behaviour. What is it in the service of? So one behaviour can have two very different valencies, two very different meanings and outputs, depending on what value it's in the service of. And I think what Zizek and the political critiques of resilience remind us is that we have to be aware that certainly in Anne's case, these kind of disciplines of mindfulness, the idiosyncratic version of distress that said it's the individual's fault, were actually, in a way, a cover for not changing anything at the institutional level. So, and that's what Zizek says. He says it's that Western Buddhism is a perfect ideological supplement to late capitalism. So the machine can go faster and faster and madder, and all we need to do is be mindful within it, and so the machine never has to stop. It's an interesting critique. It's worth some time. He's a good writer. So, but back to Anne. So what did Anne change? Well, first of all, she did make sense of her story, and because she was smart, and because she was interesting, because she was curious, but because her life depended on it in some way, or certainly her well-being, we talked about a lot of the stuff we've just talked about, and she could see that the meeting of biology, biography, her personality, she knew she pushed herself too much, life events, work culture, what the psychologist might talk, or the psychoanalyst might talk about in terms of institutional transference. I don't know if people have noticed, but institutions do seem to have become unkinder to their employees in austerity economies. And all of that stuff, plus just luck, who she happened to meet on her referral path, actually manifested in her body as physical symptoms. She changed what she could, so we did some work around her caring for herself a bit more. The other thing she did was leave her job. I'm not saying that anybody should do that, but for her, actually, that was the only way she could change the context. There was no way she could see of changing behaviour within that context. The context needed to change. So, have I got about 5? Yeah. I wanted to kind of zoom out a little bit and to talk very briefly about some of the other work that I'm doing, and some of the work that I'm probably enjoying the most. So for the next few Wednesdays, we're going to be, and have been for the last few Wednesdays, we're going to be in a kitchen with a documentary filmmaker, a sociologist, me, a health psychologist, food scientists, nutrition experts, and chefs, or one chef called Sam, who has been trained in, the Heston Blumenthal kind of molecular gastronomy techniques. All of us are basically there at the service of a bunch of head and neck cancer survivors, because the thing that they mourn, that they miss, that they talk about all the time is food. And because of their treatment and or because of the operations, a lot of them have dysphagia, i.e. they can't swallow properly anymore. So there's all these northern older adults who are missing beer, they're missing chips, and cheese sandwiches. So we're trying to work with these fancy chefs to see, can we change the texture of food so we can actually give people a cheese sandwich or a chip again? And we did. We gave a man his first cheese sandwich in 7 years, and we caught it on film with the documentary filmmaker. You can see it online, and his face is just a joy. He's completely transported. So this is to illustrate that one of the things that we've really found out in doing that work, we're working with head and neck cancer consultants who are great at this stuff. They're great at talking about the anatomy of swallow. And people need to know about that. They need to actually know if they're going to aspirate or choke. So the bio stuff is important. But we're also working with sociologists who are looking at commensality. So commensality is the stuff that happens around food. It's the sharing. It's when you get the Indian food, it's going, do you want a bit of that? It's the publicness and the relatedness that happens around food. And for some people with head and neck cancer, what they mourn as much as the taste is the commensality, that eating has become an intensely private experience, and it's become an intensely mindful experience. We talk about mindful eating usually like it's a good thing. For these people, their survival, literally some of them, depends on them being 100% mindful of their eating, because if they don't pay attention to the passage of the food down their throat, they're literally going to choke. So mindful eating, not necessarily a great thing when you can't do anything else. So that work has really illustrated to me that it's not just thinking across the disciplines, it's bringing the disciplines together to focus on those conditions. And we're finding similar work in the stuff that I did with Katrin. Where's Katrin? With chronic cough, finding a similar range is important. Weight cycling, fear of falling. This is all transdiagnostic, multidisciplinary work. And it goes back to that thing about engrossment being interesting. I've learned tons from working with people from other disciplines, stuff I would never have learned staying within my silo. So, last slide, I promise. I think this takes us back to the idea of stories. I think, if you think about the work that Anne did, if you think about the work that we're helping GPs to do around medically unexplained symptoms, but if you also think of how you bring all those disciplines together, we need to become better storytellers in a way. There's a new book, I think it's probably out this month, by Randy Olson. I just like the title apart from anything else. Houston, We Have a Narrative. And what he talks about is that when we scientists talk about our work, we're very good at piling one moment, one detail atop another, and a constant series of ands. And he says what we need to get better at is actually the basic elements of storytelling. Rona was talking earlier about competencies in how psychologists need to deal with long-term conditions and medically unexplained symptoms. And even at that level, I think one of the competencies I'm increasingly convinced is important is the ability to tell a story. What is a good formulation if not a convincing narrative story? So, yeah, and I guess my point is by talking together with other disciplines, we're more likely to be able to construct convincing and coherent narratives. I'm going to end by thanking the various funding bodies who have funded some of the work I've been talking about. Any opinion, particularly the political ones, are of course my own, and not the funding bodies. And that's kind of it, folks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for a really truly interesting and fascinating kind of talk, which took us on I think quite a journey through both psychology as a philosophy. You touched upon movies, you touched upon science and clinician type work. So what I'm going to do first of all is ask anyone here. I've got a number of questions that people have submitted to us in advance. Has anybody in the audience want to kick things off with a question for Vincent, please? Rona, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a really interesting story. I guess one of the things that we were talking about in a workshop yesterday about conditions of justice was the idea, a little bit what you were talking about, Anne's case, the idea of these critical events. Yeah. Is that better? Yeah. The idea of critical events where you intervene versus kind of chronic stressors. So when you've got any kind of condition, it brings along a number of chronic stressors like managing your symptoms. Absolutely. And then other than these critical events, and what is the best time for intervention? Yeah. So I was interested in what your thoughts are. You say you very rarely get people at these critical times, and should we be doing something about that?
I think so. I better talk over here. Yeah, I think so, and it's why because am I right? You're doing some work on early intervention in fatigue. And I think almost trying to stop the fatigue becoming chronic. And I think the earlier we get in, I think there's some evidence around this, the better. But it is about, and you see it in friends, you see it in colleagues, and you see it in patients. The earlier you catch someone before the behaviours become entrenched and institutionalised, before the support network is built up, even before people are financially dependent on the sickness status, and a whole bunch of stuff accretes around illness eventually over time. I think the quicker we can get in, the better. But part of the problem, and the reason that we're doing work in primary care, is that and it's just one factor that leads to this very circuitous pathways in a lot of conditions, is that there's a lot of GP anxiety. I better send you for another referral in case I've missed something, then you come back, and then you go for another referral, then you come back. So it can be often a year, 2 years before the GP actually goes, there's nothing else I can find. Maybe we need to think about symptom management. That's 2 years of your life gone. So yeah, I think we also need to change the way we deal with these, with any kind of distress, from the primary care level upwards, I think. But obviously that's a big ask.
I think that this counter-argument, I fully agree with that in the context of this, but one of the things, work that we've done on multiple sclerosis has been when we talk to people, say, around the point of diagnosis, which is one of the most distressing parts of the illness, a lot of them say they actually don't want intervention at that point, that actually it's too overwhelming. They often need to go into a period of denial, pretend that it's not there, and particularly in the context of that illness, sometimes you can, because the symptoms go away for a while.
It depends where you are in Act 2, as it were, because that echoes the work that's been done in critical incident debriefing and trauma, that if you get people in too early, it almost fixes them into a story, so you're fixing the narrative too early. So I think you're right. I think people need a bit of time in the wilderness to figure out what the elements are. And if you kind of go to sort of premature storytelling, as it were, people can get stuck in their narrative. But yeah, I think timing is important. But I think we err on the side of too late rather than too early in most conditions.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's kind of go for one of our in advance questions, if you don't mind, Vincent. So this is from Astrid, and Astrid might actually even be in the room, possibly, from the University of East Anglia. And Astrid asks an interesting thing which touches upon what you talked about today, which is the idea, how do you manage potential conflicts within the healthcare system such that there's an implicit hierarchy? She talks about the idea that some views are seen as more important than others. So in your own experience, is there a way in which you feel we can manage that better?
Oh, that's a really difficult one. I think it goes back to luck. I have been lucky enough to work with a consultant, Professor Julia Newton, who's probably one of the most democratic medics I've ever worked with. And if she has her area of expertise and she completely values me, the OT, the physio, the sleep specialist, that's your guy's bag. So it's a genuinely multidisciplinary effort. How do we make everybody like that? I think you're asking. I have absolutely no idea, but I think the more that we're moving towards acknowledging that it's not just our particular part of the jigsaw that matters, the more that because I think we sometimes use the biopsychosocial model to beat medics up a little bit, and I think once we acknowledge their expertise and they acknowledge ours, and actually we have a dialogue, they admit, I'm really good at this bit, Julia does stuff I just couldn't do, I do stuff that she couldn't do. Once we acknowledge that we need that kind of joined up thinking, particularly in complex and long-term conditions, no one discipline's ever going to have the answer for that. And so I think it's about that recognition.
Great. Another very topical question has just been sent through to us yesterday, which is your thoughts on, it's slightly political, but I think it's maybe worth asking nonetheless. What are your thoughts on the idea, first of all, that the leader of the opposition has introduced a Minister for Mental Health, and also within the context of multidisciplinary working? Any thoughts? I think it's a good thing. I assume the answer is yes, but maybe some more thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted actually to go back a slide because I don't think I credited him. And I should have. Where is he? Yeah, the phrase is there. Mark Fisher, who is he's a left-wing social critic who I think the new Shadow Chancellor has read, has produced a brilliant book that I'm just in the middle of reading at the moment called Capitalist Realism. It's a critique of neoliberal ideology, if we want to be political. And he says that what is completely missing from the way that we talk about stress is potentially any acknowledgement of systemic factors in it. And this is what he means by the privatization of stress. We've turned it into an individual fault. We've turned it into the behavior, the cognition of the individual, and we're completely disavowing any systemic or political or social responsibility for that. Like any polemic, you're going to disagree with some of it, but it's a great polemic and it's really well written. So I think it's great that I'm aware this is going to be on YouTube for the rest of my life, but I'm aware the kinder party, who have just elected the new leader, it's just how it feels, has actually said, actually, we need to pay attention to this. We need to actually look at the way systems are affecting people's mental health. I don't think that can be anything but good. Yeah.
Great. This question is from James Taylor from Liverpool. And James asked the question, which is a slightly unusual question also. Which role do you prefer, being a health psychologist or, as he describes you, a lifestyle self-help guru?
If anybody's read the book, they'll see it's a very odd beast. I don't think it contains one bit of advice. It doesn't tell you to do anything. It's much more a reflection on the stuff that we know. A lot of it is the kind of multidisciplinary, arbitrary movie references I've been doing today, but it's much more a meditation on how we are as creatures. So I don't see myself as a self-help guru. The thing I'm really enjoying at the moment, working, and I don't want to plug it, but the thing I'm really enjoying working on at the moment is the fact that my research, my clinical work, and my creative life are all converging around this notion of how we break. So all of them are kind of converging in that. So I kind of like them all, and I like the fact that they converge.
Okay, great stuff. Just checking time. So before I move on to another question, anyone in the audience got a question for Vincent? No? Okay, great. Well, I'll continue with the in-advance questions. So this is from Liz Cole, who's a health psychologist trainee in Shropshire. And she asked the question, what are the challenges that you feel health psychology faces generally, and particularly trying to work more effectively in a multidisciplinary setting?
I think there are many people in this room who are much more qualified to talk about this than I am. And I'll only echo some of the stuff that came up in Rona's workshop today, looking at clinical competencies, where we were talking about turf wars around the potential clashes between clinical and health psychologists, and how do we move from feeling that we're competing in a kind of zero-sum game, a kind of either-or configuration, to a both-and configuration, where we actually see that clinical psychology and health psychology can learn from each other. And I think, I don't know, it always strikes me when I come to health psychology conferences that it always comes up. The question of our identity always comes up as a profession. I've been to clinical psychology conferences. They never talk about it. They never worry about who they are and what they do. So I do wonder if we need to just, I don't know, just do it, or kind of, be a bit clearer about what it is we do, rather than worry endlessly about who we are. I don't know. I have no cogent answers to that one, but there are people in the room that do.
Excellent, thanks for that. This question comes from Jane, who is from Newcastle. I feel like some sort of strange person here introducing. It's like Simon Bakes back in the 80s. But anyway, so she asks a very interesting question, and the question simply is it not okay to break?
I think the first line of the new book was going to be, we're all broken, because I think, certainly we're all very breakable. I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about some of the political and philosophical critiques of resilience type approaches. There is an implicit message there that you just need to cowboy up, that if things are difficult, you just need to step up a gear. And there is something in there that it's very difficult not to be political about, and it's very difficult not to talk about kindness, compassion, and actually stepping outside of those systems. So no, I think it's definitely okay to break. I think most people, if you live long enough, you will, one way or the other. And I think a lot of the systems that we're embedded in give us the message that it isn't. And I think we internalise a lot of that unkindness, or certainly a lot of the clients I work with do, and a lot of my colleagues and myself. So yeah, it is, but it isn't.
And then related point is the question about stigma, and the stigma both about mental and physical illness, and the fact they aren't seen as the same.
Yeah.
Are your thoughts, is there anything we can do to try and make it more equal in terms of mental illness as well as physical illness?
It's a really difficult one, I think, because I've been working in the area that used to be called, and it's still a terrible term, psychosomatic medicine, where people are showing up with physical symptoms, also with emotional damage or emotional consequences of physical symptoms. I've got very used to thinking of them all together. So if you talk to someone who's depressed, they're also fatigued. If you talk to someone who's fatigued, their mood is probably low, or they're probably at least very frustrated. So I think that it really, it's probably important that they've each got their own pathway, but I also think that if you look at the whole person, it tends to be, it's very rare that you get someone who is just anxious or just fatigued or just depressed. There are normally some combination of all of them. So that's not quite the answer you were looking for, but yeah, I do think we need to look at these things kind of in their comorbidity as well.
Okay. And time for one final question, which is from, it's anonymous, this one, and I'm not entirely sure why, but so how, within the context of a cash-strapped public sector, do we maximise a truly multidisciplinary approach?
Well, I think I'm in danger of what's called scope creep. Here, how do I make everything better? You give it more cash. You give it more cash.
I think that's a very appropriate and timely point to finish. Can it leave me now just to thank Vincent one final time for a really, truly interesting and fascinating talk.
Thanks,
and also one which demonstrates what a health psychologist can do in both practice as well as in science. So many thanks again to Vincent.
Thank you.